Great. Well, the first speaker is Igor Agostini of the University of Salento, and he will be talking about sense and imagination in Descartes' Meditation 2. So, Igor.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you to you, to Dana, to Claudia, and to the seminar. This kind of invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here again with you, so in this virtual form. But it's really a great pleasure. So I hope to give a good paper for you. It is very well known that in Meditation 2, after discovering the existence of the ego, Descartes proceeds to determine its nature. This determination develops in two fundamental steps. In the first, the meditator affirms that thought is inseparable from him and discovers that he is a res cogitans. In the second, by asking himself what else is still praeterea, he finally obtains the definition of res cogitans. But what then I quote? I am a thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, is willing, unwilling, and also imagines and has sensory perceptions. The same definition will return at the beginning of Meditation 3. Thought is therefore articulated in a plurality of acts. The reason why, despite the doubt of the first and the second meditation, from which thought alone can escape, all these acts can enter into the definition of res cogitans, is that they are internal to thought itself, because they constitute its modes. In this sense, also sense and imagination, despite doubt, belong to thought, because they are not bodily acts, but mental ones, and therefore really identical to thought itself. And this is one of the most innovative aspects of Meditation 2. On the one hand, senses are rejected from the ego, but on the other hand, they are integrated into the definition of thought. There is no inconsistency here, contrary to what Gassendi objected. Indeed, in Descartes' new conception, sense and imagination are modes of thought. This novelty will be celebrated and commented on by Descartes specialists. For example, Martial Guéroult claims: est-ce qu'à dire que l'intelligence doit exclure de ma nature l'imagination et le sens de la même façon qu'elle exclut de celle-ci le corps lui-même? Nullement, car l'imagination et les sensations sont saisies directement dans mon esprit comme des pensées, tandis que le corps est hors de l'esprit et non connu. Alquier lui fait écho en disant: imagination dans les pages précédentes avait été exclue, mais elle ne l'avait été que dans la mesure où elle suppose les corps comme leur organe ou leur objet. Ici, toute hypothèse sur l'origine ou la base organique des sensations étant rejetée, je constate que j'imagine et je sens. Imagination et sens font donc partie de ma pensée et peuvent être affirmés de façon certaine. These readings are based on textual evidence. Vis imaginandi cogitationis me partem facit. It is therefore true to maintain that sensation and imagination are, like thoughts, Guéroult, or part of my thought, Alquier, in some reduced to modi cogitandi. And it is the redefinition of imagination and senses in terms of thought which allows them to be integrated into thought. Descartes will insist on this point with Gassendi. Niquilque quod ad illos pertineat anime tribuo, praetere id solum quod est cogitatio. However, there is a substantial difficulty here. In fact, the fact that thought and imagination are as modes of thought explains, of course, how they can all belong to the res cogitans. Nevertheless, this doesn't explain how they can be distinguished one from each other and from other modes of thought. Alke, as we have seen commented, I see that I imagine and I sense. But the problem is exactly to know what to imagine and to sense mean here. Now, these terms cannot be taken in the sense of the bodily imagination and sensibility, as if the meditator meant, I am aware of perceiving bodies. Indeed, the doubt of the first meditation extends both to the other bodies and to my body, which have therefore been rejected. Of course, imagination and senses involve thoughts, but the problem is posed precisely by their inclusion in thought, because the risk is that senses and imagination are absorbed in thought itself in an undifferentiated way. Alke himself sees these difficulties when he observed that Descartes établit l'existence d'un moi pensant dont toutes les opérations semblent égales. If to sense and to imagine mean only to think, without further specification, these modi cogitandi will not be differentiated one from the other. And this is not true, according to Descartes. It is clear, indeed, from meditation 2, that the res cogitans is articulated in modi cogitandi which are distinct one from another, imaginans quoque et sensiens. Now, the most part of commentators, as if dazzled by the inclusion and thought of senses and imaginations, have not explored the conceptual conditions for their distinction in the second meditation. The only commentator, in my opinion, who has glimpsed this problem was Jean-Luc Marion in his book on the passive thought in Descartes. Marion made a point which is, in my opinion, decisive for the understanding of the second meditation and more generally for the Cartesian doctrine of the mens. The res cogitans, he claims, can in no case be accomplished as cogitans without being passive. However, according to Marion, if the res cogitans is defined by senses, this is because I have a body, my body. This is the ultimate ground for Marion's thesis, which may otherwise seem too paradoxical, of the indubitability of meum corpus in the first meditation. How could Descartes in the second meditation define the res cogitans as sensiens and imaginans if he had doubted of his body in meditation first? Now it's clear that in Marion's interpretation, these difficulties overcome. When I have sensations, it is my body that has sensations, and it is through my body that I imagine. Thus, sense and imaginations are distinguished from all other modes of thinking which don't presuppose my body. The meum corpus allows not only to include sense and imagination in thought, but also to distinguish between them and them from the other modes of thought. Now, it must be observed here that certainly at the end of the path of meditations, one will know that if I sense, this is because I have a body, but this is not true in the second meditation. So the inclusion of sensitivity, of senses and imagination in my body doesn't presuppose, in the thought, sorry, doesn't presuppose the existence of my body. But if this is true, and Marion's interpretations has to be rejected for the very reason that I doubted of my own body, the problem remains to explain how is it possible in the second meditation a differentiation between sense and imagination and between them and the other modes of thought. In fact, my point is that an analysis of the second part of meditation 2, in particular of page 27-28 of Adam Tannery 7, may offer a more adequate answer to the problem. This sequence from Adam Tannery 27, line 18 to Adam Tannery 29, line 18, must be read as a phenomenological description by the meditator of his mental hex. And this description must be read as aiming at a definition of sense and imagination, which is not simply in order to include them in their res cogitans, as cogitationes, but to distinguish them one from another and both from intellection. Let's see. Having demonstrated the inseparability of thought from the ego, Descartes proposes the first provisional definition of res cogitans as mens sive animus, sive intellectus, sive ratio. He adds that these are voces mihi prius significationis ignote, because, as he will explain to Gassendi, he remembers having considered in the past thought as the main part, precipua pars, of the soul, while now he realizes that thought constitutes it in its entirety, tota anima. However, this definition needs to be developed. Sum autem res vera et vere existens, sed qualis res? Dixi cogitans, quid praeterea? What else? Quid praeterea? What else? The immediately following step of the investigation leads to a negative result. The point of departure is the imagination through which the pre-philosophical opinion represents the body. Exiguum nescio quid imaginabar. But under the suspicion of the evil genius, nothing that is imagined is true. I'm not, the meditator claims, a human body. I'm not a subtle air infused into the limbs of this body. I'm not a wind, a fire, a vapor, a breath. Nothing of all that I can imagine, e fingere. But at the same time, it cannot be excluded that thought that I perceive as incorporeal on the basis of the negation of the evil genius is in reality, in re veritate, bodily. Descartes claims, indeed, I don't know, and for the moment I shall not argue the point, since I can make judgments only about things which are known to me. So it's not possible in this moment to establish that thought is not corporeal. Interpreters are divided on the reasons which prevent to argue for the spirituality of thought at this stage of meditations. But the crucial point is that this is not at all a question that the meditator poses in these lines, whose only goal has to be looked for in the continuation of the passage. It is certain, Descartes says, that my knowledge of it can't depend on things whose existence I'm still unaware. So it can't depend on anything that I imagine. And the word imagine itself points to what is wrong with the relying on my imagination in this matter. If I use the imagination to show that there was something or other, that would be mere fiction's invention. For imagining as simply contemplating the shape or the image of a bodily thing. We can now understand the function of Descartes' apparently enigmatic argument of this line. The ego's attempt to extend the knowledge of himself through the imagination is in order to indicate the right path that the ego has to follow to represent himself, that is, not to imagine. Mentemque habilis diligentissime esse avocandam. But the reason for which I must not imagine myself is not that I'm not a body, because, as we have seen, I actually don't know if I'm or not a body. The reason is that for the moment, I know precise myself as not bodily. But the very point is that if I'm able to not imagine myself, this means that there is a form of representation of myself which is not imaginative. Accordingly, independently from the solution of the question of my incorporeity, it is already certain, that I can represent myself without imagination. And this is a crucial step in the meditations, because this is exactly the moment of the discovery of intellection, with IND will be immediately after introduced in the definition of res cogitans at the line 21 of page 28, intelligence. All this now requires, as an essential condition, a definition of the imagination. And, in fact, this definition is clearly stated. Nihil aliud est imaginare, imaginari quam re corpore figuram seu imaginem contemplari. Indeed, it's only by understanding what imagination is that the meditator will be able to discover that he doesn't imagine himself, and therefore that in order to know himself, he must detach his mind from imagination and to use the intellection. In sum, first, Descartes arrives at the definition of the imagination of meditation 2 through a description of the acts of thought. 2. This description is the result of a phenomenological observation of these internal acts. 3. In order to be the object of this phenomenological description, these acts must be activated in a sort of mental execution, imaginabor. To put the things in other words, I know what is the imagination by a phenomenological description of the act of imagining itself, but this description is only possible if I perform an imaginative act. It's by executing the imagination, concretely by performance, that I know what imagination is. Adam Teneri, 727, line 1822, therefore, constitutes a sort of philosophical performance of the common sensistic definition of Adam Tannery 26, line 911. The immediate result, that is, it's impossible to attribute to me everything that I imagine, is therefore nothing more than a provisional step, which is in order to gain a much more important conclusion, a capital one, which is the only one goal that this part of the test is really addressing. That is the definition of the imagination as contemplation of the figure or the image of bodily thing and its consequent distinction from intellection. This part of the text is therefore decisive because here takes place the discovery of imagination and intellection as acts of thought co-belonging to the ego, but at the same time distinct one from each other. It is now demonstrated that thought is not an indifferent monolith, but a multiplicity of acts of different nature. And the definition of res cogitans can now be given. Sed quid igitur sum? Res cogitans, dubitans, intelligens, affirmans, negans, volens, nolens, imaginans, quoque et sensiens. So, the question, qui praeterea, what else, can now receive a positive answer. Non pauca sane ex sunt. This is not few things. The following lines indeed constitute, rather than a demonstration, a confirmation of the definition, with only the addition of a last passage, certainly essential, concerning senses. I quote the text in English. Isn't it one and the same I who now doubts almost everything, understands some things, affirms this one thing, namely that I exist and think, denies everything else, wants to know more, refuses to be deceived, imagines many things involuntarily, and is aware of others that seem to come from the senses? Isn't all this just as true as the fact that I exist, even if I am in a perpetual dream, and even if my creator is doing his best to deceive me? Which of all these activities is distinct from my thinking? Which of them can be said to be separate from myself? The fact that it is I who doubt and understand and wants is so obvious that I can't see how to make it any clearer. But the I who imagines is also this same I, for even if none of the things that I imagine really exist, I really do imagine them. And this is part of my thinking. Lastly, It is also the same I who senses or is aware of bodily things essentially through the senses. Because I may be dreaming, I can say for sure that I now see the flames, hear the wood crackling, and feel the heat of the fire. But I certainly seem to see, to hear, and to be warmed. This cannot be false. What is called a sensing is strictly just this seeming, and when sensing is understood in this restricted sense of the word, is simply thinking. This passage is the only function, nevertheless crucial, of establishing the inclusion and at the same time the differentiation of the modes of thought in the res cogitans. The second objectors will accuse Descartes of not having in any way established in the second meditation the nature of thinking substance, because the demonstration of its incorporeality was not given there. Descartes will answer, at this point, I didn't ask myself if thought was distant from the body, because I limited myself to examine the properties of which I could have a certain and obvious knowledge. And as I had noticed a lot of it multe, I cannot concede without distinctions what has been objected to me. I concede, of course, that I didn't know if the thing was bodily, but not that I had no knowledge at all of it. Multe here evoke clearly the non-pauca of the second meditation, as well as the third meditation evoke them in order to explain the genesis of the idea of number. Varias habeo cogitationes, varia cogitationes. In the light of this, the last problem that Descartes addresses in Adam Tannery 28-29, and precisely in line 24-29 of page 28, is only to integrate also senses in the definition of thought. The fact that it is I who doubt and understand and want is so obvious that I can't see how to make it any clearer. But the I who imagines is also this same I. For even if none of the things that I imagine really exist, I really do imagine them. And as for the inclusion of and the distinction of senses, is operated in the same way as for the imagination. Lastly, it is also this same I who senses, or sive, is aware of bodily things seemingly through the senses. Now, for example, I see the light, I hear a noise, I feel hot. The sive is here definitory and has the crucial function. That is the function not only to reintegrate senses into thought, but to reintegrate them precisely insofar they are senses. This allows both to include them in thought and to differentiate them from imagination and intellection. And this differentiation is possible because of the definition of senses in terms of passivity, receptivity, as Clauberg will comment here. Sensio sive facultatem habeo imagines rerum sensibilium recipiendi et cognoscendi. As in the case of the imagination, it's important to point out that this definition follows from the performance and the description of concrete acts performed by the meditator near the fire. Fire is already mentioned in the second meditation. I see the light, I hear a noise, I feel the heat. These are all concrete acts which have that are isolated by the meditator from all the other mental acts. So, in my opinion, it is only by identifying as essential to the path of the second meditation the need for a differentiated inclusion in the res cogitans of the different modes of thinking that we can understand the presence and at the same time the function of these two definitions of senses and imagination in the central part of the second meditation. These two definitions are based on phenomenological descriptions, and these descriptions are dependent on the induced performances of acts, which, of course, all come under cogitation, but at the same time are different one from each other. From them on, in the following meditations, the basic descriptions both of sensibility and imagination will not change and will be only articulated in more details. For example, what will change once the existence of my body is discovered is that it will be confirmed that we actually have adventitious ideas. But the pure phenomenological aspects of adventitious ideas, that is, the fact they seem to me to derive from external things, is definitely established already in the second meditation and will be always maintained by Descartes. And the same is for imagination, for the definition of imagination. So the second meditation inclusion of sense and imagination into thought is not at all a reduction, insofar as it is also a differentiation of them, one from each other and from thought. As a result, in the very famous sentence that closes the passage I commented above, ad certe videre videor, audire calescere, hoc falsum esse non potest, hoc est proprie quod in me sentire appellator, atque hoc precise sumptum nihil aliud est quam cogitare. In this passage, the first hoc doesn't simply designate videor, but videre videor and audire videor, and therefore includes at the same time the act of thought, videor, and the different acts of senses, which have been just above characterized by the note that unify all them and at the same time distinguishes them from all other modes. That is the fact of coming to me tanquam per sensus. That is, the distinction is grounded on the basis of a phenomenological description of senses. The fact that the ideas that I call ideas of senses are given to me as they came per sensus. It's not still true that they come from senses, from outside. But the phenomenological description that I have of this idea is that they come from the senses. And this phenomenological description is sufficient to distinguish these ideas from the ideas of imagination, from the idea of the intellect. Therefore, videre, audire are, in a sense, more important than videor. They describe the particular modalities of the act of sensibility as a mode of the mind. It is therefore the definition of imagination and senses that authorizes the addition of quoque et etiam in the two famous definitions of the res cogitans of second and third meditation, in which one should not simply see an inclusion of the type for each time I sense X, it is true that I perceive X, but rather that for each time that I sense X, it is true that I sense X in that particular mode of thought that I call to sense. In conclusion, a phenomenological description of senses and imagination is essential to the second meditation, because only this description allows at the same time their unification and their distinction under the cogitatio. The identity of the ego with itself in the second meditation is not a monolith, but is articulated in a multiplicity of cogitationes, which are at the same time included into the cogitatio and distinguished one from each other and from the cogitatio itself, but by a phenomenological description that will be maintained so developed in the following meditations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Igor.
You're welcome.
As we said before, the discussion is going to happen after the second paper, and the two papers will be discussed together. The second paper is Language, Sign, and Representation in Descartes, presented by Hanoch Ben-Yami of the Central European University.
Thanks very much, Dan. I'd like to share my screen. I have a presentation. Can I do that? Let me check.
Yes, you should be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. That's fine. You see the screen now. Good. Excellent. So I begin. This is, by the way, a portrait of Descartes you can find in the in Groningen, in the museum there. I like this one quite a lot. I'll give you first a short background for my interest in this. As I'm sure everybody here knows, Descartes was the first to claim that in representation, the representation need not resemble what it represents. This plays a major role in his theory of perception and is one of the most influential ideas you find in his philosophy, also in the sense that it has had influence outside philosophy as well. And in my book on his philosophy, published about 5 years ago, I tried to track how he arrived at this idea of representation without resemblance, but just by isomorphism, same structure. And I claimed that he arrived there by the idea of a similar representation in mathematics. He developed analytic geometry, in which geometrical figures are represented by algebraic entities and vice versa. And he transferred this mode of representation from mathematics to perception. I tried also to track the path which he followed in developing this. But then there's an obvious question that people bring up. Why did he need mathematics? In language represents reality without any resemblance. So why do you think he had to go through mathematics? And not only that, in the world, the first place probably in which he introduces the idea of representation without resemblance, he starts with an example from language and the fact that words do not resemble what they signify. And some interpreters, for instance, Roger, I'll present his interpretation soon, but not only him, and some interpreters thought that there Descartes uses language as a model for his representation and perception. So I tried to give an account of what's going on there in my book, but then I wasn't pleased with it. I continued thinking about it, and I think I have the right explanation now, but it's still work in progress. And one main aim of this presentation in front of this learned forum is to get feedback and ideas and corrections from the audience. So I try to juggle here two screens. I hope I won't make too many technical mistakes here. Right. So I start with the world, or treatise on light, and there, let me see how I do that. Okay, good. That's the first paragraph of the first chapter of the suppressed world. I'll read it in full and later we interpret it. The subject, I'm using Cottingham et al.'s translation with the slight modifications which I don't note here. The subject I propose to deal with in this treatise is light. And the first point I want to draw to your attention, this is a new point, That's why it's the first point, is that there may be a difference between the sensation we have of light, namely the idea of light, which is formed in our imagination by the mediation of our eyes, and what it is in the objects that produces this sensation within us, namely what it is in the flame or the sun that we call by the name light. For although everyone is commonly convinced that the ideas we have in our thought and say are wholly similar to the objects from which they proceed, nevertheless, I cannot see any reason which assures us that this is so. On the contrary, I note many observations which should make us doubt it. So that's the main thing he wants to establish in this chapter. The sensation of light need not resemble light. Later, we'll see that it really doesn't resemble it. Now, it's just that it need not. Words, as you well know, bear no resemblance to the things they signify. And yet, they make us conceive these things frequently, even without our paying attention to the sound of the words or their syllables. Thus, it may happen that we hear an utterance whose meaning do we understand perfectly well, but afterwards we cannot say in what language it was spoken. Now, if words, which signify nothing except by human convention, this is l'institution des hommes, suffice to make us conceive things to which they bear no resemblance, then why could nature not also have established some sign which would make us have the sensation of light? What is this sign? Even if the sign contained nothing in itself which is similar to this sensation. Is it not thus that nature has established laughter and tears? That's a different example, to make us read joy and sadness on the faces of men. And part of the third paragraph, by the way, there's no division into paragraphs in the original, the first edition. The division is later. But perhaps you will say that our ears really cause us to perceive, it's here, only the sound of the words, and our eyes only the countenance of the person who is laughing or weeping, and that it is our mind, esprit, which, having retained what these words and countenance signify, represents this to us at the same time. That's an objection by the reader. I could reply that by the same token, it is our mind which represents to us the idea of light each time the action which signifies it touches our eye. So far, the world. Now, I think already on first reading, some of the formulations in this passage might seem odd to us, and I'll say much more about it below. But still, this passage has been read as suggesting an analogy between representation by means of language and representation in perception. You find it in several authors, both for lack of time and because his interpretation is the most detailed one, perhaps. I quote here only Roger from his intellectual biography, Descartes, an intellectual biography of 1995. So let me pass to the next. So according to Roger, in this passage, Descartes answers the question, how is perceptual information represented, Roger's term, in visual cognition? And the answer is by means of a linguistic model. When it comes to the problem of representing this information, so Roger, language fits the bill perfectly. Given a finite number of syllables, an infinite number of ideas can be represented. And he continues, the linguistic model, we grasp an idea in virtue of a sign which represents that idea to us. So in the case of a conventional linguistic sign, when we know sufficient English, the word dog conveys to us the idea of a dog. Just as conventional signs do not resemble what they signify, so too natural signs do not resemble what they signify either. Descartes tells us that there is in nature a sign which is responsible for our sensation of light, but which is not itself light. So Roger has a threefold distinction here, and which does not resemble light. Does Descartes say that? All there is in nature is motion, never mentioned in this passage, In the case of a natural sign like motion, provided we have the ability to recognize and interpret it, when we grasp motion, what it will convey to us is light. Light is what we will experience when we respond in the appropriate way to the sign. So far, Roger, and a few comments on his interpretation. I'm discussing him, again, it's not only him who discusses it, but it's a detailed and well thought through interpretation, still problematic. That's why I'm choosing it. I suspect that he reads into the text our contemporary views of representation and of representation by means of language. While discussing the representation of perceptual information, Roger says that for Descartes, we grasp an idea in virtue of a sign which represents that idea to us. But Descartes never says that signs represent ideas. At first, he doesn't talk about representation at all. Only when the reader is imagined to raise an objection that words are not responsible for our ideas, but that it's the mind which represents ideas to us. It's the mind which represents ideas to us. Upon hearing words, only then does Descartes respond that this can be said of light as well. Namely, that the mind represents to us the idea of light when affected by that action. So first, the mind is said to represent ideas, not signs, not language. Also, Roger distinguishes between, as I mentioned earlier, the sign which is responsible for our sensation of light and light. And he says that this sign, which is a kind of motion, he says, does not resemble light. But we don't find in Descartes' text a distinction between the sign of light and light. Moreover, the sign is not said not to resemble light. It is said not to resemble the sensation of light. So the threefold distinction of Roger's light, sign of light, sensation of light, is not found in Descartes. We find in Descartes' text only a twofold distinction between light and the sensation of light. Also, he doesn't mention, as I've said, motion in this passage, but action, an action that touches our eye. And as we later learn in chapter 14 of The World, light is indeed an action by which our eyes can be pushed. That's chapter 14, 8097. And this supports the interpretation of the action that does the signification in this passage as light, and not any third relator. Roger also says down there some things about experience, about interpretation, which I don't find in the text, but I won't linger on them here because they are not of central importance to my point and we have limited time. So I shall offer an alternative reading of the text, which I hope will correct some features of Roger's interpretation, as well as of my own better interpretation in my 2015 book. But more importantly, hopefully it will contribute to clarifying Descartes' conception of the linguistic sign and of its relation to representation. So I think that Descartes does not think of words as signs that represent reality. I know of no place in which Descartes describes language as a representational medium in our sense of the term. Words for him are a specific kind of sign, and therefore they play a causal role, producing ideas in our mind. This is the meaning of sign and signify in the World passage and in the related one. Producer and producing, signifying ideas, not representation. And although words and signs generally did not indeed resemble what they signify, in this context, what is relevant is that the ideas produced by the words not resemble the words. The same way that the idea of light need not resemble light. That's the relevant analogy. We shall see later that Descartes became clearer on this in his later work. For this reason, Descartes compares light to words, not the idea of light. He compares light to words, the sensation of light to ideas. We can express this relation in this advanced mathematical symbolism. There we are. Light to the sensation of light is like words to ideas. So the comparison of the light to a word or to a sign, which might strike us today as odd, is not so for Descartes, because he allots to the sign a causal role and not a representational one. That's why he has this word example in this, at this place. It's not an analogy to explain representation, but an instance in which a cause of an idea does not resemble the idea. Of course, Descartes' understanding of sign has a long tradition, stretching back as far as Aristotle's first chapter of on interpretation. That's Aristotle. This is the portrait in the School of Athens. Raphael had the bust of Aristotle from later in his life, and he worked back how Aristotle must have looked when he was younger. So that's the depiction we find in that. That's Aristotle on signs from on interpretation, first chapter. Spoken words are signs or symbols of affections of the soul. Unlike the later Augustinian tradition, the sign or word doesn't signify things, but it signifies thoughts, making us think of things. If we also recall that in Aristotle's day, the written texts were always read aloud, then this causal role of signs also explains why he continues the same passage to say that written words are the symbols of spoken words. When you read the word, this plays a causal role in making us pronounce the spoken word. So this is the causal role of signs for Aristotle. And we find a similar conception later in Augustine. That's a portrait of Augustine by Antonello de Messina. Of course, we don't know how Augustine looked, but that's a nice portrait. People bother to imagine him. So this is from the Doctrina Christiana, the basic point of departure in medieval discussion of signs, medieval semiotics. A sign is a thing which, in addition to its image, which it impresses on the senses, like a word, for instance, makes something other than itself come into the mind. And we found a similar definition also elsewhere in Augustine. An example it provides is a footprint which makes us think of the animal that left it. I have other examples here, I'll skip them. As this example demonstrates, the sign does not need to represent, doesn't play a representational role. The footprint does not represent the animal. It makes us think of the animal. In this sense, it is a sign. Another example there, the sound of the trumpet, which makes the soldiers know they are to retreat, for instance. This is an example of Augustine. Is better thought of not as representing retreat, but as a signal to retreat. It makes the soldiers know that that's what to be done, right? And signum in Latin is both sign and signal. These passages of Aristotle and Augustine are the point of departure for all discussion of all medieval discussions of the sign up to the early 17th century. Now, this is a very rich tradition, and to be sure, other concepts of sign also gradually developed. Especially Roger Bacon in the late 13th century claimed that words directly, immediately signify the things themselves, not by mediation of our thought. And this spread in the late 13th, early 14th century, but then the influence waned. Mainly Buridan, the influential Buridan, adopted the old Augustinian view And this was influenced also, the main view also in late scholasticism. This one here, for instance, just a second, is Petrus Margallus, whose signs. A sign is something that makes think. So this is 16th century. I didn't find any depiction of Petrus Margallus. People, we don't know how he looked. Nobody bothered drawing any portrait of poor Pedro, apparently. I don't think I have much time, so I'll skip quite a lot. But for instance, Meyer Oeser, who wrote a lot about medieval semiotics, writes that it should be clear that the widespread opinion according to which in medieval philosophy the sign was characterized by a classical definition of something standing for something is mistaken. That's not the conception of a sign. Rather, it's this conception of Petrus Margallus, something that makes us think of what it signifies. Now, Descartes was no expert on scholastic philosophy, and we don't have any evidence that he consulted scholastic authors in the decade or so after he returned to do science and philosophy around 1620 up to the time of the composition of the world. In 1640, he writes to Mersenne about scholastic or Jesuit philosophy. So I should like to reread some of the philosophy which I have not looked at for 20 years. And he adds, I remember only some of the Cunimbricenses, Toletus, and Rubius. So let's see what these authors say about sign. I haven't had time to check Rubius properly, but he's very close to the Cunimbricenses uses for Descartes' works. Toledo writes, that's in 1561, Introduction in Dialectica Aristotelis, writes that sign is something which, in addition to knowledge of itself, induces knowledge of something else in the mind. So clearly the Augustinian conception. And he gives as an example, smoke as the sign of fire, again, like Augustine. So that's the conception we find there. If we move to the Cunimbricenses, that's the cathedral, 12th century cathedral in Coimbra. Again, this is an a very rich commentary. Only the part on signs, which is the interpretation of the first chapter of Aristotle's De Interpretatione, runs over 60 pages. So you find quite a lot there. But we are interested mainly in the basic ideas. And this is their definition. The sign is what represents something to a knowing power. Notice the use of represent here. We'll come back to it later. This is a later definition than Augustine. It doesn't commit itself to the sign being sensible. We can have a formal sign, like the essence of an angel might be a symbol for the essence of the essence of God. So they extend the concept of a sign to something formal and not only instrumental. This is how they consider the Augustine's definition. But the thing that makes us think, makes the knowing power think, that's the central thing. And this is also the case with conventional signs, those by institution. They give an example of the value of a coin. This is just as in a coin, there endures a royal ordinance in virtue of which it is thought to be of such an amount. It doesn't represent it, we think of it as having a certain value. Now, of course, we don't know what exactly of the voluminous work of Toletus, Rubius, the Cunimbricenses, and others of the period Descartes read during his time at La Flèche. And there's no way of deciding what he would remember more than a decade later. But the dominant conception of a sign to which he was exposed in that literature is of something that makes you think of what it signifies. This consists its signification. Let me return now to the interpretation of the world's first chapter. Let's look at other examples, not all examples that he mentions there, we don't have time for that. One additional example is that of sound. Most philosophers maintain that sound is nothing but a certain vibration of air which strikes our ears. There's no claim here that this vibration of air does any representational work. It's just that the sensation of sound is different from this vibration of air. No similarity between cause and effect. Next example, you will remember that, a tickling feather or a buckle or strap which presses against the body of the soldier and causes pain. No resemblance between pressure and or touch and the sensation there. No role for representation, no place for representation in our sense. So if this is meant to be another example like that of signs and words, why should we think that the representational role of words, in our sense, plays any role here? Descartes concludes, I see no reason which compels us to believe that it is that what it is in the object that gives rise to the sensation of light is any more like this sensation than the actions of a feather and the strap are like the tickling sensation and pain. So we find the analogy between the cause, the comparison of the cause to the sensation it causes. We don't find any talk about representation. Generally, the world is not a treatise about representation. Apart from the use of the term in the first chapter, to which I'll turn soon, where it is claimed that it does not have, where I'll claim that it does not have its current meaning, the term is used only 3 times in the treatise, in a kind of digressions. The talk of representation is saved for men, l'homme, where there Descartes goes in detail about the relation between the representation of sensation in the nervous system and what it is represented without resemblance and so on. The world, light, is not a treatise about representation. It's a treatise in physics, and all that Descartes had to establish there is not a claim about representation, but about the lack of resemblance between cause and sensation. How much time do I still have, by the way? I started later. But...
Well, it's a couple of minutes after 1. Igor stopped approximately 1:35, so probably about 5 minutes. Can you finish in 5 minutes?
Right. Okay, so I'll obviously skip a few things. I'll say something about his use of representation in that chapter. I quote this thing again, this passage again. The reader is supposed to say that it's the mind which, having retained what these words and continents signify, represents this to us. What does this represent mean here? I don't think it means what we mean by to represent. And again, it's not the word that do the representation, but the mind. I think the meaning here of represent is to present again, represent what the mind has retained. And this is indeed the use of represent in this context in the medieval literature. The conversences are explicit about it. Again, when they're using, talking about signs and thought, represent is to make something present. It's not that Descartes doesn't use representation, something close to our sense elsewhere in his work, but at this place, this is what it means. Okay, I have to skip now something important and what the light is a sign of, and I'll and also other uses of talk about sensations or as signs, and I'll run forward quickly to the principles, if I find it. Yes, that's section 197 in the fourth part of the principles, where Descartes gives a kind of condensed and I think clearer presentation of what we find in the first chapter of the world. The world, of course, hasn't yet been published then. It was published only posthumously. So this is a new material. And I'll break this section of the principles into 4 parts to show how it follows the structure of the first chapter of the world. And also I'll give you some running commentary on what's going on there. It can also be proved that the nature of our mind is such that, just a second, that the mere occurrence of certain motions in the body can stimulate it to have all manner of thoughts which have no likeness to the movements in question. This is especially true of the confused thoughts we call sensations or feeling. So just to note, this is like the first paragraph of the world in the claim it contains. Second paragraph here, the word example, which we don't find anywhere else in the works Descartes published during his life. For we see that spoken or written words excite all sorts of thoughts and emotions in our mind. With the same paper, pen and ink, if the tip of the pen is pushed across the paper in a certain way, it will form letters which excite in the mind of the reader thoughts of battles, storms and violence, and emotions of indignation and sorrow. But if the movements of the pen are just slightly different, they will produce quite different thoughts of tranquility, peace and pleasure, and quite opposite emotions of love and joy. Notice that although the battles, storms, violence might be described in the text, the emotions need not be mentioned there. So the point here is that the words excite in us thoughts, they don't even need to signify. The important thing is that these thoughts, ideas are different from the words. And now, third part of this paragraph, it may be objected that speech or writing, again, we have the reader objecting the way the reader has objected in the world. Do not immediately, I don't see it well, just a second, please. Immediately excite in the mind any emotions or images of things apart from the words themselves. It merely occasions various acts of understanding which afterwards result in the soul's constructing within itself the images of various things. So this part here, that the word merely occasion acts of understanding, this is the part which was described in the world by means of the verb to represent. Here, we drop representation at all. We see that what representation meant there is that we have acts of understanding which result in constructing. So this is constructing within itself the images of the various things. This supports the interpretation of the represent in the first chapter of the world as not standing for what we understand by representation, but for what the human senses also understood, this construction. Last, we forget about the word example, and we moved to examples by touch. We don't have the sound thing, so it condenses the whole thing. What will be said of the sensations of pain and pleasure? The sword strikes our body and cuts it, but the ensuing pain is completely different from the local motion of the sword or of the body that is cut. It's different as color or sound or smell or taste. And the conclusion, like in the world, we clearly see then that the sensation of pain is excited by us, in us, merely by the local motion of some parts of our body in contact with another body. So we may conclude that the nature of our mind is such that it can be subject to all the other sensations merely as a result of other local motions. No resemblance here, and the word example doesn't even need to talk about what words signify. Certainly not ascribe any representational sense used to words or language. It's just the difference between words and ideas. So to conclude, Descartes does not compare representation and perception to representation by means of words. In fact, he never describes words or language as having any representational role. Words for him play a causal role, making us conceive or think of things. These are the things they signify. That's it. Thanks.
Great.
It's unrelated, but a beautiful image. I stopped sharing.
Lovely image. Thank you very, very much. Thank you both, though, both Hanoch and Igor, for interesting talks that actually I think do offer a lot in common. I just sent a note around suggesting that if anybody would like to participate in the discussion, send me a brief note. Give me just a very brief sentence or two about what it is that you wanted to talk about so I can organize the conversation. And if there are no questions yet, let me pose a question to both speakers individually. Igor, your point is that in the second meditation, and really you were talking about the first half of the second meditation, already Descartes is distinguishing between sensation and imagination on the one hand, and pure intellection on the other. What role do you think plays in the discussion of wax later in the second meditation, where he's also distinguishing, I think, very carefully between sensation and imagination on the one hand and pure intellection on the other, not to mention the beginning of the sixth meditation. And Hanoch, you're talking about sensation and imagination from a somewhat different point of view, emphasizing the extent to which the sensation and imagination does not necessarily resemble the object that is being sensed or imagining. But if that's the case, what is it that you think distinguishes sensation and imagination on the one hand from pure intellection on the other? Descartes, for example, in the second meditation, talks about imagination as contemplating the shape or image of a corporeal thing. What does that mean if there is no resemblance? So Igor.
Or you go first.
Go first, yeah. Igor?
Do you hear me?
Now I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question, which is very interesting. In fact, I think that also in the final part of the second meditation, that is in the example of wax, Descartes continues to distinguish between senses, imagination, and intellection, because I think that the distinction that it makes, that place between senses, imagination, and intellection concerns not the bodily and the corporeal sense and imagination, but just the sense and imagination as mode of thoughts. So I think that both the part of the second meditation, the central part of the second meditation, this is the one that analyzed, and part of the works establish a distinction between sense, imagination, and intellection. I focused on the central part because in that part we have the discovery for the first time that these two these three modes of thought are in fact separated. In particular, I think that Descartes is concerned with imagination, because in the second meditation, in spite of what many commentators claim, Descartes is not worried about senses. He's worried about imagination, because the idea that the imagination can grasp the essence of the soul as an elevated point of view in respect of the idea that all the world, included soul, can be grasped by senses. So imagination is evoked just in order to show a higher level of knowledge of the soul made by little by little atoms, subtle atoms. So the discovery of the intellection is made just in that part of the meditation, in order to show that imagination, far from being the higher form of representation of the soul, is lower than intellection. It's not the right way to represent it. So I completely agree with you. Also in the third part of the meditation, we have a distinction, and this distinction is among modes of thought. But I think that in the central part, we have the discovery of the intellection. Before that moment, I don't know that I have an intellection.
No, absolutely. I think this is one of the remarkable things where he says, this I that I had no idea about before, no conception of before this moment. This mysterious I think it's very important, and it is, the discovery of a mode of cognition that had been completely unknown to him in the first meditation. Well, thank you, Igor. Hanoch?
Yes, thanks. And just to repeat the question, since sensation and imagination do not resemble the physical reality, let's say, that are supposed certain sensations to represent, you are asking what's the difference between these modes of thought and pure intellection, for instance. Yeah. So as I understand Descartes, sensation and imagination are confused. It's always confused ideas for him, which we can have only when the mind is united with a certain body. For him, it's the pineal gland. It's the confused thoughts, which are, in the case of sensation, the activation of the pineal gland united with the mind by something external. In the case of the imagination, these ideas which are on the pineal gland, he says that explicitly in more than a single place already in the world, these ideas are created by the soul. So the difference between sensation and imagination is in the origin. Sensation affected by something external, imagination, the soul itself creates these ideas. And indeed, after we die and the soul separates from the body, we don't have sensations or imagination. It's also explicit in Descartes. So that's.
But still, I mean, for now, you were talking about the. I'm sorry, it was Igor who was talking about the phenomenological distinction between sensation, imagination, and pure intellection. If none of these, strictly speaking, resemble something on the outside, certainly they're going to be different causally. But phenomenologically, what is the difference between, say, an imagination of a triangle and a pure intellectual grasp of the same triangle, if neither of them actually resemble the triangle, say, that exists outside in the world, say a drawing on a board?
I'll continue. Just saying, let me open the window. Got quite hot in my ideal city. I think that the qualitative aspects, the red color, the specific timbre of the sound. This does not resemble bodies, but the shape of which we are aware does resemble, literally, the shapes of the space around us. The soul, when it is united with the pineal gland, is aware of specific shapes in this body with which it is united. So although we don't have resemblance when it comes to the qualitative parts of sensation, we do have resemblance when it comes to the purely geometrical properties like distance, shape, size. So we do.
Which is to say that the language analogy is only partial. The word apple, either as a series of sounds or as a succession of letters, resembles in no way the fruit.
Yes. But
on the other hand, the image of the apple that I have in my mind does, perhaps in shape, resemble the fruit, though not in color.
Yes. He's interested there in light. So he's interested primarily in the qualitative aspect. And unlike the Aristotelian tradition, he would like to say that this qualitative aspect is merely mental. So he is interested only in the aspects in which we don't have any resemblance. He would like to get rid of them when he turns to the description of the physical reality. So although when I see an apple, the apple does resemble my sensation of it in the shape, it does not in the color, say green, red, and that's the important thing for Descartes there. That's how I see it.
Okay. Dana has a finger. You need.
Yeah. Sorry.
There we go.
Just to press your question, Dan, forward. So I liked very much the phenomenological description that Igor gave us. But I was wondering, what is the phenomenological difference between imagining a triangle and having the intellective act at the end of which I have a triangle in my intellect? Because, of course, I mean, you know, if the only thing is that these are two different acts that everyone knew at Descartes' time, and they wouldn't have been surprised that you do see imagination on a sort of a lower level than intellect. That I mean, no one would have disputed that. But what is the precise phenomenological difference between imagining a triangle and the intellective act through which I see the same thing? Because, you know, Descartes is having these examples of a polygon with 1,000 sides and things like this, things that I cannot imagine, but say an object that I can imagine.
Is that directed at or Igor, both?
I suspect it's directed at Igor, but, you know, I mean, if anyone feels like jumping in.
I'm sorry. So I think that in the part of the second meditation that I've analyzed, Descartes is not concerned with this distinction between an intellection and an imagination of the triangle, because he's much more concerned with the fact that I have a form of representation which has not as object a body. Okay, and this is the basic distinction between intellection and imagination. Imagination cannot represent something which is incorporeal. So I think that the first moment in which we can have a distinction between imagination and intellection concerning extended things is exactly in the passage mentioned by Dan before, that is in the passage of the walks. Because there Descartes claims that I'm not able, by imagination, to finish the infinities of the movements and the changements of matter. So when I imagine, I have the experience of a limited force of my representation. I'm not able to achieve an infinite series of changements, of potential changes of figures and movements. And I think that this difference, which is just a mere phenomenological one, is comes back again in the fifth meditation, because there Descartes claims I cannot imagine 5 sides of geometrical figures, but not infinite sides. But there Descartes uses this phenomenological difference in order to argue that perhaps I have a body. But the phenomenological description and the phenomenological distinction remains independently from the fact that I have a body or not. So I think that the first moment in which in the meditations we can have a difference between an imaginative and intellectual approach to the knowledge of geometrical figure is in the piece of works.
Okay, thank you very much, Igor. There's a question from Bill Eaton.
It's really very similar to your question, Dan, and it's just that once, I guess it's for Hanoch, once you admit this resemblance problem, it seems to easily transferable to shapes too. So how can we have clear and distinct ideas of shapes? Why should we expect those clear and distinct ideas we have of shapes to resemble objects in the world? If light doesn't have to resemble our sensation of light. So yeah, I just think it's a real problem, almost in a Berkeleyan sense.
First, thanks, and something I forgot to mention earlier.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talks.
Thanks very much for the compliment. And I managed to cover about 2/3 of my material. If anybody would like to read more, I can send you the paper, and I would really appreciate any feedback you can give on this really work in progress thing. So just drop me a note later.
Maybe you could put your email address on the chat.
Okay, I'll do that in a minute. Now to Bill's specific question, I think that we have our clear and distinct ideas of extension not through the mind union with the pineal gland. God, put these ideas innately in us, like the stamp that a king would like to put
of his laws.
In his correspondence with Mersenne. So we have the innate ideas, and that's why they are clear and distinct. And that's why when we don't try to imagine anything, then we can think about a polygon with 10,000 sides. When we try to imagine, we are really limited. So the clarity and distinctness are not due to the either imagination or perception of specific figures, but to the innate ideas which God imprinted in our minds. That's how I see it.
So are you saying that bodies don't really have the geometrical properties we seem to sense?
No.
They don't resemble?
No, bodies do have geometrical properties.
But I think the same resemblance problem then transfers to these basically primary qualities, the modes of body too. But I maybe I'm just confused.
So Descartes in the sixth meditation indeed tries to struggle and defend the resemblance for geometrical properties, but not for qualitative properties. It's a real question whether he manages to do that. That's a different question. But for him, there is a difference here because the bodies around us really have geometrical properties, and the idea of geometrical properties, the ideas were imprinted on us innately. So that's why we can conceive them clearly, and indeed there is a resemblance between shapes of bodies which do not come in contact with us, and shapes on the pineal gland. So this is how he manages to merge the different shapes. Although if you were limited just to sensation, you couldn't be sure that you have these clear ideas of extension.
Okay,
What is the level?
thank you so much. And can I just add that your causal theory of science, it's going to have me thinking for at least a month. It's very fascinating.
Oh, I should have a hat to take off. Virtual hat, everything here is virtual.
Enrico Passini unfortunately has to leave. He left a question that I think is very interesting. Unfortunately, it is a little, I wish he were here to explain it a bit. He said, "It is not clear to me whether these two quite interesting presentations offer compatible views of Descartes' positions," which is an interesting question. I'm not sure exactly what it is that he had in mind, but let me put that question to the two of you, Igor and Hanoch. Do you think your positions are compatible?
I don't know. I'll tell you the truth. When Igor was talking, some of the time I was thinking about what I'm going to say here and what I'm going to say there. I didn't follow it closely enough. I need to read it in order to decide or watch the YouTube video. I really apologize, Igor. I started
No.
But gradually I started thinking about my own face.
No problem at all, Hanoch. I think that in fact they're compatible because I considered the imagination, senses and imagination in a very basic level, a very basic phenomenological level that precedes all the successive integration that Descartes makes in the following meditations and in the other writings. So the level that I consider is the very basic level and description of senses and imagination. So I don't see any incompatibility. Perhaps Enrico has seen something else, but it's difficult now to interpret the question.
Exactly. It's an interesting question, but I'm afraid I'm not able to say what Enrico was thinking. There's a question now from Lauren Slater.
Hi, thank you so much for two really interesting talks. I really enjoyed that. So my question is for Hanoch. And I suppose my question really is about the kind of causal similarity in Descartes and whether or not that creates an issue. So I know that the causal similarity principle and whether or not Descartes held to it is a contentious issue, but if he did, then I suppose it might, I suppose one motivation for this kind of linguistic model of perception is that it solves the problem if you have a kind of sign to signified relation between the mind and the body, then it can be this maybe quasi-causal, but not strictly causal relation because of the dissimilarity between the mind and the body. Perhaps Descartes can't have it that it's just a purely causal role. I just wondered if you had anything to say about that condition or whether or not that's an issue.
Thanks very much. I think that from the world on, Descartes doesn't, in any of his published or writings on or anything he prepared for publication, like The World, which was published posthumously, as we know, doesn't hold the similarity principle between cause and effect. Now, that's not something that everybody thought then, and it was a new thing for him as well, I think. That's why he starts The World with this longish chapter to say, guys, it's possible. We don't need resemblance between cause and effect. What remains of that the idea that cause resembles effect in his considered philosophy, let's say, is the idea that the effect cannot have more reality than the cause. And this plays, of course, a major part in his proof of the existence of God in the third meditation. But that's not similarity, that's degree of reality. The effect cannot have more reality than the cause. I know I actually searched for this in his writings. I know of only one place in which the similarity thing comes up. That's in the conversation with Burman, in the account that Burman writes down. And Descartes, you know, at some stage mentions it. And then Burman asks him, hey, wait a second, but this doesn't... So Descartes doesn't say, he never says anything like, oh yes, sorry, I was confused. He wasn't familiar with the term. He says that you know, he tries to elaborate his view so that eventually we end up with the effect not resembling the cause. So whenever he writes something considered from the word on, I'm not sure whether you find it in the rules. I think the rules is silent about this possibility. He rejects the similarity position. Okay, that's
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
very much.
Okay, there is a question from Jeremy Hyman, who unfortunately was not able to get onto Zoom, but has been watching us on YouTube. And so I will read out his question since he's not able to read it out himself. I very much enjoyed Professor Agostini's paper. I would like to hear his comments on two passages about imagination. One, Meditation 6, AT 73, where Descartes seems to say that the difference between intellection and imagination has to do with where the mind turns, convertat. And two, a parallel text to Burman, AT 5, 162, where Descartes asks and answers, quid aliud inspicere est an intellegere? What is that inspection? That is imagination. Is it understanding? How do these two texts compare with Meditation 2 and the phenomenological account there?
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Jeremy. It's a very, very interesting question. I think that both the passages that in fact are very similar one another, I'm quite sure about that. These two passages, it is question of the imagination as mode of the mind, but of a mind which is supposed to be united in the body, passage with Burman, or passage of sixth meditation, of a mind that is trying to prove the existence of the body. So, in fact, what Descartes is claiming is that the imagination implies a sort of effort. How do you say in English? Effort.
Effort.
Sort of effort, because this effort is implied by the presence of the body. So my phenomenological lecture precedes this level, and is not contradicted by these two levels, because in fact the imagination is just as in a phenomenological level the impossibility to grasp the infinity of the parts of a triangle of whatever body. So this is impossibility then is explained by Descartes by the presence of a body, my body. So the two passages are referring to the imagination as mode of thought, but a thought who is potentially sixth meditation, because this is before the demonstration of the existence of my body, and actually connected with my body conversation with Burman. So the level is different, and the difference of the level doesn't change. It doesn't affect the phenomenological description of imagination.
Okay, thank you, Igor. There's also a question from Jeremy for Hanoch. Is a causal role necessarily inconsistent with representation?
No, we can be caused by, I mean, in perception, we do represent the things we perceive, and they affect us. So when I'm looking at the screen now, the light coming from the screen reaches, well, presses, you know, it's the globules turning and pressing. So the light coming from the screen presses against my eyes and so on and so forth, and something is created on the pineal gland. So we have this causal path, which ends with something which does not resemble in the qualities it has anything on the screen, which is mere extension, but there are correspondences between the what's going on the pineal gland and the mind and the screen. And this correspondence is responsible for the representation that can even be adequate, although there's always some confusion in these ideas. So certainly causality and representation are compatible. And in perception, we do have representation through the causal influence of what we perceive on the representation on the pineal gland, with some exceptions, but that's the rule, I think. So no incompatibility between causality and representation.
Great. There's a question from Daria Dozdova.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to both of you. It was very interesting panel. And my question is mostly to Igor and Agostini. Your presentation, yes, it's quite phenomenological reading of cogito. So how we can, by considering cogito, to discover different levels of reality, because we can distinguish different modes of cognition, like thought, imagination, and sensation. And could we go forward with that without thinking about necessity to discover God, who will grant us reality and truth and so on? What do you think? Can we just develop this line to discover this other of us?
In fact, I think that I've also already also read your question in the chat. My point was that we have to find a way to distinguish between sense, imagination, and intellection, one from other, in the second meditation, where we don't know that we have a body. This is the key problem, because I, of course, can include sense, imagination in thought, even if I have not a body, because I just say they are not bodily sense and imagination, but they are just thoughts. So I can easily include in thought, even if I have not a body. But the problem is, how can I claim that sense is sense and imagination is imagination? So how can I distinguish them? As far as I know, the first interpreter who tried to address this question was Jean-Luc Marion. And the solution that he gave to this problem was that this is possible because, in fact, in the second meditation, I have my body, because Descartes has never doubted about meum corpus, but only about other bodies. So as I think that this is not correct, in my opinion, Marion has seen very well this problem, but the solution is wrong because Cartesian depth extends to body, to all kinds of body, my body included, of course. So the idea was to look for another solution, and the solution that I excogitated was to see in the second meditation a phenomenological description of acts, and which is in fact led by a performative activity of the soul that actives these acts, imaginabor, for example. This is the idea that I gave in my paper. As concerning your question, I think that, of course, if we have to give a complete account of sense and imagination, also considered as mode of thought, we have to introduce the body, of course. But just to give a complete account and description of them. And in order to prove that there is a body, my body, of course, I think that we need the existence of God and the veracity of God. So it's not possible to affirm the existence of my body without the veracity of God. And in this sense, also the explanation, the complete explanation of sense and imagination as mode of thought, of course, as bodily activities, need the existence of my body and the veracity of God. But this is just in order to give a complete explanation of them. In particular, as concerned the idea that imagination is an effort. Okay.
Let me make just a little comment on what it is that you said about Marion's interpretation, which is a very intriguing one. The idea that we never, because we have sensation, even in the sensation and imagination, even in the beginning of the second meditation, we never get rid of the body. He seems to be, I think, ignoring the passage on Elementary 27, where Descartes says, "And yet may it not perhaps be the case that these very things of which I'm supposing to be nothing, that's to say bodies, because they are unknown to me, are in reality identical with the I of which I'm aware. I do not know, and for the moment I shall not argue the point, since I can make judgments only about things that are known to me." In a certain sense, the body is there, although Descartes doesn't know it at that moment. So I think that your reading, Igor, is exactly correct. I mean, Marion's reading is very daring, very bold, and imaginative, and not altogether right. But there is a question from, just a moment. Had it here. Alessandro Becchi, who unfortunately had to leave, but I think it's a very interesting point that he's making. So let me read what he wrote, and just to get your reaction to it. Many thanks to Igor and Hanoch for their interesting and somehow complementary talks. They make me reflect on the not secondary role of the imagination in rationalism, and on the notion of sign in Cartesian epistemology. Do either of you have anything that you'd like to say in response to that?
Yes, I think that, well, yes, imagination sometimes gets bad literature in Cartesian scholarship. Imagination is necessary for science, and he has two places where he, one in the conversations with Woolman, and one in his correspondence with Princess Elizabeth, where he says that you shouldn't do too much philosophy, because it corrupts the mind. The really important thing is what we call science. That's the place where reason and imagination come together. So you have to use imagination when you develop imagination, not in the sense of fantasy, but of visualization or reflecting on your sensations. You have to do that when you do science, and that was perhaps the most important thing for Descartes. So certainly, imagination has an important role in his rationalism.
Thank you, Igor. Do you have any comments that you'd like to make on that?
No, I just want to greeting Alessandro, even if he leaves, because he was a student with me in Florence. We were students together in Florence, and we followed the classes of Massimo Mugnai and other professors in Florence. So it was very nice to have Alessandro here.
No, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that he had to leave before we got to ask the question. Donna, you have another question for Igor?
Just to follow up, I think, on Daria and on my previous question, that somehow to me it seems that if you introduce this phenomenological interpretation, then one thing you're left with is the fact that you basically you get kind of if you describe phenomenologically, what does it mean to have an act of intellection, and what does it mean to have an act of imagination? You end up with having different kind of, I said, states of mind that you can recognize corresponding to an act of intellection and act of imagination. And these are there even after you finish with the meditation, okay? So again, I'm pressing my question. How you distinguish between the state of mind? Is it a state of certainty or a state of, how do you distinguish between the state of mind corresponding to an act of intellection or an act of imagination relating to the same very object, like a mathematical figure? Because you have all the instruments to distinguish this. At the end of the meditations, in principle, you have done all the steps through which you can distinguish between these two acts of mind relating to the same object.
Yes, my point, perhaps I'm not sure that I completely understood your question. In any case, my point is even at the end of the meditation, we still have this phenomenological distinction between sense and imagination and between all the modes of thought. We still have, we don't lose this distinction. But we need to integrate these descriptions of these modes of thought, both because they are at work in the following meditations, and we discover other features of these modes of thought. And also because in the sixth meditation, we discovered the existence of body, and the existence of bodies obliges us to add other characteristics to this basic phenomenological description. My point is that this phenomenological description gained in the second meditation will remain until to the end of the sixth meditation. And in this sense, I think that there are corresponding state of mind to these two forms of thought, and the state of, or the corresponding state of mind don't change.
No, I completely agree, but that creates problems for Descartes, because then you have the mind acting, the mind of the mathematician acting in the way of imagination or acting in the way of the intellect. And well, I don't know whether I'm able to.
No, okay. Perhaps I see the point. The intellection, for example, the intellection remained the same. The state of the mind is the same if intellection consider, for example, God, or it consider a triangle, intellection is still intellection. Because I think we have to distinguish between the mode, of the thought and the operation of the mode of the thought, okay? And this distinction is made by Descartes in many other passages. For example, with the Hobbes, we have to distinguish the faculties from the operations. So the faculties is one, and the different operations with different objects concerns the acts and not the faculties in itself. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, one last question from Evelyn Perron.
Hi, yeah, it's a simple question, really. It's just I was expecting the notions of the distinct versus confused to play a role in the phenomenological account of Igor Agostini, and I was just wondering why they don't. Because it seems like you could distinguish between sense, imagination, and intellect in terms of degrees of distinctness, right?
Yes. In fact, this is a very good question. It's quite similar to the question that moved down at the beginning of the seminar. But in fact, I think that we don't dispose of the notions of clearness and distinction in that part of the meditation. So we discover what clearness and distinction mean in the very same moment in which we discover the difference between imagination and intellection. So at that moment, there is not at all at work the couple clearness and distinction. But because it is discovered in the very moment in which I discover the distinction between imagination and intellection. But this is at work in the piece of in the third part of the meditation, on the second meditation, in the discussion of the works. And there Descartes says something very similar to what Leibniz says. He says, my perception of the works has always been an intellection, in fact. The difference is that at the beginning, when it was a sensation, this intellection was obscure and confused. And then, now that I discovered this is in the mind that perceives the works, is clear and distinct. So I didn't speak about clearness and distinctness for these two reasons, that they are not introduced in the passage that I considered, but they really are introduced in the passage of the works.
Thank you, Igor. One last question from Dolores Yoritzo. Dolores? You have to turn on your microphone.
Yeah, thanks to both speakers. I'll just read what I said. I mean, this group is a tight-knit group, and everyone follows from week to week. So I wonder how this rather abstract account of imagination and sense relates to Gideon Manning's notion of Descartes having an obsession with medicine and making medicine of the human body, anatomy, cure of diseases. Are these two things just completely separate entities, or do you think in some way Descartes tries to make sense of these two things? Because of course he has a faculty psychology, and I mean, for someone who's looking at Descartes from, say, a Baconian point of view, it's bizarre that he has such a hard time with the mind-body problem, but this is what makes him famous. So sorry if this is a naive question.
Thank you very much. This is a little more difficult to me to address this question because I want to insist on the fact that I limited my paper to speak on this preliminary level of the imagination. This is conserved and maintained in the following meditations and also in the writings concerning medicine. But I've not inquired this kind of use of imagination by Descartes. What is for sure is that each time that Descartes speaks of imagination in other contexts, in such contexts like medicine, and more generally, every time that he speaks about human bodies, he speaks of the imagination or of the imagination as mode of thought, but united with the body, or directly of imagination as mode of body. So they are a more complex level that are not concerned at all in the second meditation, in my opinion. Thank you.
If I'm to say something, I don't see a tension there. So in the when we imagine things, we create all sorts of images, right? And we manipulate them. We also think, and this is something that Igor emphasized, when we apply the imagination in the natural sciences, we don't only come up with the images, but we also manipulate them, think about them. I don't see a tension here. Certainly Descartes was a very imaginative scientist, where when you read his physics, he comes up with indefinitely many ideas about shapes and motions and so on and so forth, in order to explain various astronomical, microscopical, and so on phenomena. I don't see a tension here between the general account of imagination and its application together, as Igor mentioned before, its application in the natural sciences. And Descartes, I don't think he was obsessed with the mind-body problem. He didn't even think about it until the 1640s, when people started pressing him on this. And then he had to meet this serious problem, this serious issue in his philosophy. But this wasn't a motivating or even a thing that crossed his mind, perhaps, until quite late in the development of his philosophy, as I see it.
But you must admit that there's a big difference in the texture of the language, of the way he talks about anatomy and cures of diseases, than in this far more abstract way.
Yes, absolutely. The scientific writings are full with hypotheses, all sorts of models and suggestions on how the mechanics of things work and so on. We don't have any of this in the abstract considerations of the immaterial soul. So certainly there's a difference in style, but this doesn't mean that there's any incompatibility in the positions. You have to disconnect yourself from the senses in order to think properly about the immaterial abstract things. But this doesn't mean that you cannot apply yourself to the senses in other contexts to generate other forms of knowledge. So I completely agree that there's a difference in style, which he actually thought you shouldn't do too much of this abstract thing. The thing, you mentioned Gideon as saying he was obsessed with medicine. It was the practical results were really important for him. So certainly difference in style, difference in significance, but I don't think there is a theoretical tension. It's not that I don't think there's, okay, Dan is making all sorts of science. I'll stop here.
I think we're going over. This was, I think we should thank both of our speakers for a very lively session. That was very, very interesting. Next week, Graham Clay and Michael Jacovides are doing a joint session on David Hume. And you should all note that we sent around a request for proposals for sessions further on in the spring. This series is going to end in December. We're going to begin again in February, and we're looking for proposals. So if you have ideas of sessions that you think would be interesting for the seminar, send us your proposals. Thank you very much and have a lovely rest of the week.
Same to all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was very nice.